Hello, everyone. We are very happy to welcome you to the 10th webinar of our series. And as you may know, the pandemic has forced us to, unfortunately, postpone our Science Polish Perspectives conference from May 2020 to May 2021. But we did not want to just wait for a year. So instead, we worked hard on providing you an alternative. So here we are. And before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to remind you that all information about upcoming webinars are available on our Polonium Foundation website. We are continuously planning our events, so the website is updated on a regular basis. And also, apart from the website, news on the webinars and other things are posted on our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we are also very excited to have NAWA, the Polish National Agency for Academic Exchange, as our partner. So without any further delay, I would like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Kasia Szymańska. Kasia is the Thomas Brown Assistant Professor in the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultural Studies at Trinity College Dublin. She was previously Junior Research Fellow in Modern Languages at the University of Oxford and remains associated with the Oxford Comparative Criticism and Translation Research Center. Today, she's going to give a talk titled Why Translating More Than Once Matters. And there will be time for questions from the audience at the end of the talk. So to ask questions, please use the raise hand function that shows up when you click on participants list, and I will unmute your microphone. Or you can just type your questions or question in the chat, and I will read it to Kasia. So I think that's it. So Kasia, are you ready to share your screen?
I guess so. Let's see if it works. Okay, and now I have to use the full screen. Is everything visible?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone to my talk. The title is Why Translating More Than Once Matters. And first of all, thank you, Dominika, for your kind introduction. And well, thank you, Polonium Foundation, for the invitation as well. I feel like this webinar series is a great and much needed initiative, especially now in the times when we can't really be connected in any other way. So thank you so much for this. So before I start my talk, I just wanted to say a few things about how I became interested in translation, and in particular translation of literature, because most of my examples will be from translation of literature here. And a lot of you might have this impression that translation is just a mere copy or some sort of secondary or not very interesting reconstruction of the original text. But as I worked with different translations, I kind of came to realize that I usually, when I read translations and when I read what is allegedly the same text in different languages, I actually read a completely different text. And this sort of intuition is also shared by a lot of bilingual people, for example, who feel that when they express themselves differently depending on the language, or they actually have different personalities. And it's almost the same with how texts sort of function in different languages. They also have those different personalities. But before I start again, I just wanted to say that this sort of misconception that, well, translation is some sort of copy or secondary reading or some sort of, replication of the original is so strongly and rooted in our culture, because it starts sort of already at the level of primary education and then secondary education. So for example, when we learn a foreign language at school, we usually do that through translation, and there are always right and wrong answers. Translation sort of becomes something mechanical, and it becomes a very uninspiring teaching tool and also a testing tool, which can be a nightmare for a lot of school students. So this is one problem. Another one is that, for example, when we read foreign works at school, like, for example, for those of you who are not English speakers or not German speakers, for example, Shakespeare's Hamlet or Goethe's Faust at school, teachers very rarely, I feel, mention that what they present to the students is just one version of many available in a given language. And they very rarely also mention the translator's name. So that kind of results in the situation when a lot of general readers, they are very oblivious to the fact that they deal with a rewritten and completely transformed text in a different language. So this is where I start, and in my talk, I'll try to explain why this sort of situation is not ideal, to say the least, but in some cases also potentially dangerous. And I'll start with a slightly maybe untypical slide with one film scene from Yorgos Lanthimos' Kynodontas, which can be translated as the dogtooth. This is usually the official translation, but sometimes it can be translated as the canine tooth or eye tooth. So for those of you who haven't seen this film, I'll just briefly explain that in this film, there's a despotic father who has invented an entirely closed society for his long imprisoned oblivious children, and controls them by translating the foreign world for them into his own infantilized categories. So, for example, the mortal enemies of the households of the household are cats, which visit the garden. A child is able to leave the house only when their canine tooth falls out. And also, new words can be learned from tapes recorded by the parents. So, for example, the children learn that "C" is a leather chair from the living room, and shotgun is a type of bird that you can see in the garden. And this sort of vocabulary is, you see, limited by their horizons, but also the borders of their house. It's kind of spatially constrained to that household. But here on the slide, you can see one of the scenes where the father performs a simultaneous interpretation of Frank Sinatra's song, "Fly Me to the Moon," into Greek. And he completely reinvents all the lyrics one by one in his translation. So here you see, these are actually English back translations in the subtitles, but basically he pretends that the singer was the children's late grandfather, who in his song expresses love for the family and convinces them to all stay together. So here the father sort of takes advantage of his children's lack of command of the English language, and he enjoys a monopoly for truth in translation. Of course, unless he's confronted with by other interpreters with their alternative readings, he can continue to cherish this uncontested and exclusive license for translation. In other words, without other voices of protest, he keeps the children in the dark, blinded by his totalizing illusion. And why am I starting with this particular scene? So what struck me about this scene is that it is actually not very different from our usual practice of reading translations. So this is us, most of the readers, who are usually happy with just one version, which stands for the original. And we sort of treat this one version as this kind of one-to-one substitute for the original. And when I say most of the readers, what I mean by that is that no one really goes to a bookstore, right, to buy 5 different translations of War and Peace and compare those different versions just for fun. Well, this is something what we translation scholars do, but no one really goes there just to and buy those different versions just to enjoy the variation and different reading experiences. Although a lot of readers and viewers do that, for example, with film adaptations. So I don't know, they're fans of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, who kind of binge watch, different adaptations, and people have their favorite takes and then watch one after another. But that very rarely happens to translation. And another similarity to this scene is that readers read translations because they don't quite often know the language of the original. So they kind of want to have access to the original text via the medium of translation. And because of that, they usually want to have some sort of substitute or SparkNotes version of the original in their native language. Of course, this is some sort of illusion that we have access to the original meanings, imagery, words, and so on. But if this is the function of translation, then usually one translation or one version is enough to replace this original. So this is the state of affairs, but in real life, translation is multiple. So it can be multiple in 2 key aspects. It can be multiple at the level of historical production. So we know that there are retranslations. Translation comes in series. So for example, there are multiple translations of the Bible with competing versions leading to political crisis. And you can see this kind of big collection of different translations of the Bible on the slide. But also translation is multiple at the level of translation process. So each translator comes up with multiple possibilities for one phrase, one word. But then for some reason, at the editorial stage, they have to narrow it down. They have to narrow down this, array of possibilities to just one version, to just one variant, because there's some sort of pressure to publish this finite, ready to go, ready to read product, which is a book of translation. And of course, we know that translators are dissatisfied with this state of affairs. We see that, for example, in footnotes, glosses, annotations, in brackets, because they are so unhappy with, just giving one possibility that quite often they want to present more, although there is some sort of pushback, of course, because editors hate footnotes, especially in literary translations. So there's this tension, I feel, between something that is singular and particular in publishing or in the kind of general perception, the readership, and something which is plural or potentially plural in the universe of translation. And this was sort of the starting point for my own project. I was really interested in that weird conflict between those two natures, really, of translation. So in my book project, recently finalized book project, I've been looking at least 15 longer pieces and books fully composed of multiple translations of the same original. And just to kind of clarify, I wasn't interested in academic anthologies or some sort of critical editions of Dante in English, Baudelaire in English. But instead, I was interested in those fully fledged literary works, which are composed for some reason of multiple translations of the same original. But they are supposed to be read by general audience. And this is this new form of, or new genre of writing. So I call them translation multiples. And I tried to sort of make sense of how to read this newly emerging genre. We are talking about at least 15 books or at least 15 works in English. And these projects were primarily, the ones I'm talking about here, they were primarily created in English by North American and British authors, but also those who consciously use global English as their language or as the language of their creation. So for example, in this mix, I had a Uruguayan artist or a Norwegian French multimedia artist. I had Italian and German writers who, for some reason, decided to adapt English as their language of creation. And these were primarily writers, translators, but also, for example, in that mix, I had an American professor of physics and cognitive science, Douglas Hofstadter, you might have heard of him. So he was very much interested in exploring this potential of form, machine translation, and translating under constraint. And his book, which you can see here on the slide, Le Tombeau du Marat, in praise of the music of language, it was composed of 88 different translations of just one French poem. And it was accompanied by commentaries as well. And he was very much interested in exploring this idea that there's some sort of music in language. And this number 88 translations was also supposed to represent the standard number of piano keys. So standard number of keys in a grand piano is 88. So this is one example. Another one was composed of 47 different translations of the first 3 lines from Dante's Inferno. Again, another one was composed of 18 different versions of an ancient Chinese poem. I had Japanese examples as well, ancient Greek, and so on. All of them were translated into English multiple times. So in my book, I offer those different interpretations of how to read these kind of strange works and how to also enjoy them. So what they really try to communicate through this texture of multiple translation. And I'll just show you one example, which is Caroline Bergvall's Via, or Via. You can also read that. So on the left-hand side, you can see her project, Caroline Bergvall's project, where she chose over 40 translations of Dante's Inferno, or actually the first 3 lines from Dante's Inferno, and put them together. This is just a short excerpt, so these are 5 out of 47 versions. So just to give you an idea of how many there are, she had at her disposal 200 different translations of Dante's Inferno in English, which were available in the British Library. She chose over 40 for this project. So these first 3 lines feature a speaker who admits to being halfway through the journey of life and to have lost the right path. And you see that in the English version, so in this kind of English long chain of translations, this fragment gets reiterated through the voices of different translators and people who also maybe feel that they are lost in the middle of their own lives. So in a sense, each time this translator speaks about this, this feeling, this experience of getting lost, they speak about it differently. And this poem sort of becomes also a journey, a path via language, right? But also some sort of reflection on the fact that there's actually no progress, because whenever, the speaker speaks about this sense, basically, we kind of go back to the same starting point. And just to kind of make one comment, this is already a very small space. So you have 3 lines, and none of these lines are identical out of those 47 different versions. And if we zoom into each of these single words, phrases, and images, they will take us along similarly meandering different routes. So on the right, you can see a visualization of this, of the kind of 2 different words, how they also split in multiple possibilities in those 47 different variants. So you can already see this variation at the level of very small word choices, via and camino. In the original Italian, camino is a walk, a way, via is a path, route, but they have been translated differently, with some of the versions sort of overlapping and some crossing paths. So you can see sometimes via becomes, a journey or a pathway, right? Whereas camino becomes a way, and so on. And also these words, if you look at them, they have different meanings and connotations. So there's high road, trek, course, journey, travel, and so on. So similarly, when Dante talks about dritta via, that pathway, road in those different translations can be either a direct, straight, or narrow path, where emphasis is on the shape. It can be straightforward, where emphasis is on the easiness of travel. It can be true, right, and rightful in some of the versions. And here the emphasis is on the moral trajectory, right? The rightful, the right path, the right way of doing something. So what gets exposed thanks to Bergvall and this variation is, well, first of all, the process of translation. So translation seems something very tentative, and a rather subjective exercise. So depending on your reading of the original, what you want to underscore in your version, there can be a completely different interpretation or some sort of different shade or different meaning that you come up with, that you achieve in your translation. And then translation is a never finite text, because there are, well, technically plural possibilities for each passage, as you can see. So in a sense, just one translation becomes just this one partial reading of the original. And I interpret those works as a very important gesture, in particular in the context of global English, and which is the contemporary lingua franca. And it has been chosen as the language of translation multiples for most of these creators. And I think it is not without reason, especially that English is quite often criticized for being very insular and reluctant to translation, and let alone the translation that comes in series and multiple variants. Just to give you some data, only 3% in the UK and Ireland, and this figure is similar in the US, of books published yearly are translations. So in a sense, maybe this says or tells us something about the exposition of English to other cultures and other languages, just 3%. And I'll also try to compare this to other other, for example, countries in continental Europe. So in a sense, I see those translations or those translation multiples as very subversive projects because they multiply different variants of the same originals in order to draw the reader's attention to the very fact of translation. So look, this text has been transformed in process. You can't just swallow it so easily in the ocean of English language production. There has been some sort of mediation going on in the process, so please be alerted to yet another layer of uncertainty. This text comes from a different language. It was originally written by someone else. So this is what these texts seem to be saying. So for this reason, multiplying translation is a very important practice in this transfer from other languages into global English. And quite a few scholars recently made this point that the digital space can be a very promising platform for offering plural renderings. So for example, Rebecca Wolkowitz made this point that the digital, the kind of digital publishing or online publishing, in particular literary journals, can more easily release various takes on the same original with the fear of adding extra pages and generating extra shipping costs, which is, well, a common problem when printing in hard copy. So it's easier to generate multiple versions and publish multiple variants in online publishing, right, in the digital space. But also there are two research projects in the digital humanities where this multiplicity of translation comes to the fore. So the first one is Translation Arrays at Swansea, which takes a scene from Shakespeare's Othello and traces its 37 German renderings published until 2012. And it sort of looks at which original passages are most prone to variation and tries to answer the question why. Then another one, which you can see here on the slide, is Prismatic Jane Eyre at Oxford, of which I am a proud member. And it focuses on various translations of Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, rendered into over 50 languages in over 500 different versions. So it sort of looks specifically at these textual differences and linguistic variation in different versions in one language, but also in other languages. So as you can see, this multiple translation has become a very exciting field of study. And as I was working on multiple translations and those translation multiples, in particular those books in English, I asked myself whether I know any translation multiples or similar projects in Polish, my native language. And I actually did identify a few examples, but I felt like they had quite a different heft and resonance, in particular political resonance, than the Anglophone example. So I'll quickly explain what's sort of different in terms of the backdrop and sociopolitical context in those examples. Well, so first of all, translation occupies a very different position in Polish culture, which is closer to continental Europe. So the percentage of books published in Poland that are translations, they range, well, the percentage ranges from 25 to 40, depending on whether we count translations in all books, both new and reissued titles. But regardless of which figure we take, let's take the first one, 25, it is quite close to other European countries. So 20% in Italy, well, 16 in France, 12 in Germany. But that doesn't really compare to 3% into English, right? So this is one factor, one key aspect. So translation has a different role, has a different position. And then they were all created after 1989. And in a sense, they testify to this political transition, which happened, 1989, a very important political and economic milestone in Poland. So they become some sort of touchstone of this political transition and also changing publishing landscape. And what I mean by that is, first of all, that with 1989, there was simply a technical possibility of, for example, multiple versions commissioned by different independent institutions. There was a shift from the authoritative state-run publishing order towards a more decentralized system, allowing for the multiplicity of versions. So in the previous one, you had quite often canonical and officially anointed translations. And after 1989, these translations were often challenged by other versions. And this, for example, this tendency holds for many translations of what was perceived as literary classics, so translations which were, or books which were often retranslated. So for example, the series of foreign classics released by the state-run publishing institute PIF had a few titles where basically this trend was quite similar. So the scenario was as follows. You had the same canonical translation, which was reprinted, recycled for decades, around 50 years, with multiple re-editions of one official rendering. And then after 1989, this official translation was challenged and split into at least 3 different renderings. So that was after 1989. So to name a few examples, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, but also Gustav Flaubert's Madame Bovary, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, all might illustrate this mechanism. At least 10 re-editions, canonical translation kept, right, for those 50 years. And then after 1989, 3 or more competing renderings, which entered circulation. So this is one aspect, this kind of publishing context. But then variation also is something in particular in those translation multiples, which I looked at in the Polish context, which becomes a pretext for generating different ideological readings and for discussing different political visions on a par with one another. And this is something which I identify as this pluralist gesture of translation multiples in the Polish context, and I'll explain that in a bit. But basically the premise is that if you display more than one variant, more than one translation, more than one ideological reading of the original, then you also, by implication, accept someone else's different stance, you accept someone else's different political view, or ideological interpretation of historical events. So this is also the way in which those translation multiples, the creators of those translation multiples, try to dismantle this Cold War binary of friends and foes, which was quite common, especially in the 90s. And I know that a lot of Western history books stop at this successful transformation later. So in a sense, those translation multiples become also projects which kind of comment on the other side of the coin. Well, transformation might be promoted as a success story, but there are still some problems which are overlooked too. So this is something where it does, like all the problems don't stop when the bodies are gone and the newly, goodies arrive, the heroes arrive. So this is more or less what these translation multiples convey as well. But also these ideological discussions are related to the shifting identity in Poland from 1980s. And in culture, it is quite often manifested in cinema and literature as a recurring leitmotif of twins, alter egos, and doppelgangers. So for example, Kieslowski's Double Life of Veronique, you have one twin in France, the other one in Poland, they never meet, right? So this leitmotif kind of represents that Poles really struggled with those problematic belongings. The questions were, are we part of the West? Are we part of the East? Who should we side with? How to come to terms with the conflicting narratives of the roundtable discussions and so on. And before I'll show you a few translation multiples, I'll again use an example which basically kind of imitates this structure of translation multiples, which is again a film. So the film I have in mind is Kieslowski's Przypadek, which can be translated as blind chance. This is the official translation, but also it can be translated as coincidence or a case. And in fact, this is a case study of 3 different scenarios or 3 different kind of life paths of the protagonist, Witek. It was initially produced in 1981 on the wave of the Solidarity coming to prominence, but then it was banned by the Polish authorities until 1987. And the plotline was constructed as a study of 3 different life paths of Witek, a young protagonist who decided to catch a train to Warsaw after his father's death. And now, depending on whether Witek caught the train or not, whether he met a friend on the train or a railway guard on the platform, his story unfolded in 3 different directions. So the first scene is the same, but then it sort of splits into 3 different directions. In the first scenario, the man got involved in the Communist Party and became a state apparatchik. In the second one, he turned into a religious anti-communist and worked in underground publishing. And then in the final version, he completely withdrew from political concerns, trying to lead a private, apolitical life. Well, so here the question is, if Witek is really the same person, the same original self, and then he just gets translated into those three different coincidental circumstances in all these three scenarios, then how could he possibly grow into a regime supporter while also having the potential of becoming an anti-communist dissident in his parallel life? And what's maybe quite surprising is that he really remains a good-natured and decent man, regardless of the trajectory he has accidentally started following. So by studying three lives of Witek on equal footing, the director suggested that the good could still reside, regardless of the political barricades, in conflicted Poland of the 1980s. And the reception is quite telling. So at the time of the release, critics could not come to terms with Kieslowski's unbiased narrative, which lacked a pronounced political line. And already at the script stage, his project was attacked by official critics for anti-state demagogy, whereas Solidarity viewers later accused him of being a social realist filmmaker. So in a sense, this multiplied composition was something which really teased out those contradictions in the Polish society, as it seemed impossible to kind of reconcile all differently thinking and acting Witeks in the period of political tribalism. And what I mean by that is the period of the Solidarity movement, so 1980s until 1989, where basically you have the binary, you belong to this camp or the other camp. What's very important to my project and my way of thinking about translation multiples is that this film anticipates the structure of post-1989 translation multiples in Poland. In particular, one example which I'll explain, which I'll describe as the last one, but now let me just show you what sort of material I was looking at. So I have three examples of Polish translation multiples. So one was published in Puls, or Pulse, a London-based Polish political quarterly when Polish government was in exile in London. And it published a very telling translation multiple of Stanisław Barańczak, who was a Polish poet, dissident activist, intellectual, and later Harvard professor. So instead of an essay or a journalistic piece, which would be more common for this type of magazine or political quarterly, he translated the French anthem La Marseillaise into Polish in multiple variants, each time commenting differently on the fall of communism. And these stances range from skeptical, optimistic to indifferent. So what's quite important is that one of the speaking voices there expresses his doubts about the whole project of the political transition and considers even a retreat to the previous state. And this voice is very, again, tellingly suppressed and pushed off the stage by the members of the Western choir. And this seems like a very ironic commentary on the state of democracy at that point. It's fine as long as we accept it, but then it has to be still imposed and any voices of protest are pushed off the stage. So this is one of the examples. Another one is Translation Multiple, which was recently published by a group of translators affiliated with a then popular magazine, Literatura na świecie, Literature in the World, as they attempted to revise this corrupt status of Bertolt Brecht in Polish culture. And I'll explain that in a bit. But first of all, let me say that Literatura na świecie was a really great venue to look into. It was a liberal bi-monthly magazine, which was published from 1971. And during communism, it had the print run of over 30,000, often 35,000 copies. So it was a very popular magazine. And it did publish multiple translations, often accompanied by commentaries on different approaches. And for those of you who follow the Polish politics, it also featured a very interesting argument between one translator and a very controversial now right-wing politician Janusz Korwin-Mikke on different translations of Jabberwocky from Alice in Wonderland. And actually Korwin-Mikke offered his own alternative translation of Jabberwocky himself. So this also shows something about, the importance of translation, and that translation was actually, something worth fighting for. But when we go back to Brecht, before 1989 in Poland, his works were quite often manipulated in publication, censored and tailored for different audiences. So depending on the context and translation variant, he would come across as either pro-communist or anti-regime author. And in the official circulation, he kind of reinforced the state propaganda. He was, like socially left-wing. But on the other hand, well, he was also a very anti-systemic writer. So his works were also used by dissident intellectuals and the solidarity activists in the underground press. And here you can see that his poem was printed on solidarity posters. This is the kind of red and white poster. But also, for example, his different poem was, and it's also tellingly that this poem is placed among solidarity members on that poster. On the bottom, you can see a bulletin, a regional bulletin of the Solidarity with another poem translated on the front page. So those translators who published the book on the right, Ten Cały Brecht, which can be translated as All That Brecht or This Whole Brecht, they tried to descend from that corrupt legacy of Bertolt Brecht in Poland, who sort of became a battlefield for opposing factions. They did that by multiplying different variants and underscoring their own subjective takes on Brecht, and by not trying also to hijack them for their own purposes as it was before. And finally, my last example, I hope I still have some time, which is also my favorite example, and quite often stirs up a lot of controversies, is Clockwork Orange in 3 different versions. So throughout the 1990s, Robert Stiller, a Polish Jewish polyglot, worked on his 3 translation variants of A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess in Polish. Some of you might have heard of this example. So the original novel, adapted by Kubrick, you might know also the film adaptation, featured a teenage group of vandals speaking an invented idiolect, Natset, which was the mix of English language with Slavic and Russian modeled neologisms. And in Polish, Stiller interpreted this mixture as a symbolic language of oppression. And at the beginning, he created 2 versions in Polish. So the first one was the so-called version R, was with Russianized idiom, and it was supposed to oppose the communist legacy. So Stiller kind of speculated what would happen had the political tables not turned in 1989. And then his A version, A for American, criticized the US modeled post-communist capitalism, which happened later after 1989. Both translations, curiously, entered the market simultaneously in 1999, that's right, as a sort of literary tie-in. So you could basically buy a black and a white version, or either. And they were titled Mechaniczna Pomarańcza, Mechanical Orange, and a wind-up orange, so Nakręcana Pomarańcza. And then they were recently they were republished as one book with 2 alternative translations inside. This project had a considerable sci-fi fandom and also generated 7 reeditions for version R, 4 reeditions for version A. And it also gained some sort of cult status among devoted followers, especially that in the introduction, Stiller announced a forthcoming German version, which was supposed to be titled a spring-assisted orange, a bit like spring-assisted knife, sprężynowa pomarańcza, which was targeted at the European Union. And this unfinished text of the spring-assisted orange was published only recently after Stiller's death, and it was published by me. So just to say, these 3 hypothetical contemporary Polands, which Stiller was interested in, they all represented different forms of hegemony anchored in the present day. But at the same time, they also alluded to different political periods of Poland's political dependence over the past 2 centuries. So in the 19th century, Poland was partitioned among 3 empires, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And this is also something that shows in those translations. So just to briefly say, version R underscored the Russification in the Russian partition in the 19th century. but also the post-war Sovietization. So it uses Russian as a source of vulgar and brutal language. It's also quite interesting to see that Russian and Polish share actually a lot of words, especially which are swear words, which are vulgar words. They are cognates across two languages. Then version A showcases instances of the post-1989 Americanization with its promoted capitalist lifestyle, the flood of economic goods, and the original infamous concept of ultra-violence only in this version becomes super violence because it's also taken from a superhero blockbuster. And it's also very interesting because Alex is forced to watch violent films as part of his therapy. And finally, version N, in Polish-Niemiecki, alluded to the Germanized, so it is a Germanized version, it alluded to the Germanization in the Prussian partition of Poland, but also cast German in this role of the language of violence during Second World War. So there are some words which some Poles might know just from that context, so raus, raus, verfluchten, and so on. So basically that kind of alludes to that period. But also some of the words are adapted via Yiddish, and this is also a reminder of this brutally eradicated Jewish element of the Polish culture. And Stiller himself was a translator from Yiddish as well as 20 other languages. So just to summarize, the story of three different Alexes takes the original as a starting point for a discussion about three post-colonial readings, with Poland always being a whipping boy in the political reshuffle between three alternative spheres of influence. And also there's technically no difference in how the plot pans out in the communist and post-communist reality. And by implication, this project sort of undermines the solidarity myth with the ensuing miracle of political transformation in Poland. But also you can see similarities between three different Clockwork Oranges, or those three different Alexes in Clockwork Orange, as well as Kieslowski's three stories of Witek in Blind Chance. So this is one similarity in terms of the composition. But also referring back to our first film scene from the Dogtooth, Poland in 1989 also had to overturn its despotic father, who imposed one totalizing ideological narrative. But at the same time, it also didn't mean that with the transition of 1989, Poland had to easily slip into yet another single totalizing narrative and take it for granted. So take for granted, for example, the transformation miracle with all its intents and purposes, even though politicians often did. So what's enticing about translation multiples and similar projects is that they acknowledge those different viewpoints, and at least in theory, they serve as this pluralist platform for discussion around them. They try to point to a more inclusive and democratic type of arranging and presenting information, including political content, which rubs against the tide of political tribalism and knocks us out of our filter bubbles, at least in theory again. And let me finish on a positive note. So with their promotion of a more diverse textual and ideological spectrum, the multiples show how different worldviews and ideas can coexist, not only in translation, but also within one democratic society. So this is where I stop, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Kasia, for this amazing talk. And I would like to remind you that to ask Kasia a question, please use the raise hand function that shows up when you click on the participants list. And I'll unmute your microphone, or you can just type a question in the chat and I'll read it to Kasia. Okay, so I see the first raised hand. Okay, from Amelia. Yes, you should be unmuted now.
Okay, hi Kasia.
Hi, Amelia, nice to see you.
Kasia's my supervisor. So I've been reading some scholarship about sort of critical translation scholarship that points to sort of a translation proper, I guess, as sort of paradoxically reinforcing the idea of national languages and national literatures through presupposing these two distinct yet stable linguistic codes. And I was wondering whether you think that there is some necessity to destabilize this idea of language and whether translation multiples are a potential route to doing so.
That's a great question. So should I respond now, or are we collecting questions, Dominika? Oh,
you can respond straight away. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Emilia. That's a great question. So first of all, it is true that in general, the idea of translation kind of assumes, right, that there's a transfer between two different languages. So basically by the necessity to translate, we assume that we are doing that between two different languages. And that's quite problematic, for example, in the context of, well, translating from, let's say, in the Balkans, right, translating from Serbian into Croatian, right? Basically, if you say that we have to translate between those two languages, then you say these are two completely different national languages, although they had been previously one Serbo-Croatian language. So it is true that in a sense, translation as such imposes those hierarchies. I would say that translation multiples, they do dismantle this tension in some way, because you can have, for example, different regional variants or different ways of, also, for example, if you look at English, let's say the global English, you can see that some of the translators in Bergvall's mix were American, North American, or users of American English. Some of them were British, and basically you also see this variation between those different translations. You can see basically that in the matter of translation. At the same time, I wonder whether basically just because all of them use the idea of translation proper, they still navigate between traditionally conceived languages. So you have a translation from Italian into English, or a translation from Chinese Mandarin into English, and so on. But at the same time, I would imagine that there can be more variety and more, you know, kind of a more like playful approach to translation within those variants. So if, for example, in online journals or in the digital publishing, there's now more room to kind of experiment with translation, then I would imagine that that would leave us, that give us more leeway or more space to actually those type of those types of, you know, ways of destabilizing those differences. Yes, it's a very interesting question, because translation is often seen as something which does happen between languages, not necessarily within a language. And this is also something which has to be verified, because of course there are a lot of instances of intralingual translation. And we also, when we express ourselves in you know, what we think, right, we also in a way translate, right? We have to translate our thoughts, or the language we use at home is different to the public language we use. So we also have to translate between our small words within our language. So I do agree that there's, you know, some potential for destabilizing that difference. But hopefully translation multiples will do that. There's one great example I was looking at of Anne Carson, where basically she takes one original poem and then she translates it into those different idioms in English, and that's still a translation. She calls them translations, although technically they are translated into those different lexicons in English. And she takes, for example, the vocabulary of the microwave user's manual, and then she uses another lexicon, which is the signs of London Underground and the names of stations. And basically she treats that as my new vocabulary. I'm going to translate between those two, and that happens, you know, within English, within one language, which technically uses different codes as well. So thank you so much for this question. That's a great one.
So we have next question from Ola Sidorkiewicz. I unmuted you, I think, I hope.
Oh, hello, Ola.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, Kasia is my teacher. Anyways, my question is quite simple, and I was just interested if in your research you looked at political history of Shakespeare's translation, because obviously it was translated by a few different translators also in the communist period, and I was wondering if there was any politics to it as well.
You mean into Polish, right? So, but there was still this tension. It is true, he was translated a few times, so that would, in a sense, undermine this trend. But on the other hand, there was one officially anointed translator who translated all Shakespearean works into Polish, that's Słomczyński. And there was some sort of politics behind it, because he also worked with the state editors, who quite often took a lot of time. So in general, in that previous literary order, you had a very common trend that state editors would work for ages really on one version, for years, right? They would devote a lot of time. So a lot of people also say that's actually an advantage of that system, because basically you had really high quality translations, which were then, were very meticulously procured and so on. There was a lot of time devoted to that. But at the same time, it slowed down the other, it slowed down the production. You couldn't be, you couldn't be challenged by in any way. So there is politics involved in Maciej Słomczyński's translations of Shakespeare, where basically later Barańczak, with his own translations, he wanted to basically challenge Słomczyński in particular, because he was the one officially anointed translator who was marketed by the state press as someone who would just present all of Shakespeare to you. He was also bilingual, right? So he was an English-Polish bilingual. So that was supposed to, leave this imprint on Polish Shakespeare. And although there were also a few other versions which were published earlier, right? Still you had Maciej Słomczyński as this face, the new Polish Shakespeare. And then there's, Barańczak coming later. I mean, like, he started translating already in the 80s, but his first translations were published later, who basically wanted to challenge him, and then more Piotr Kamiński and so on. So you had more translators of Shakespeare coming later, who also quite often, well, actually commented, right, on this, on this strange situation where you have just this monopoly for translating Shakespeare, and then it must be in some way challenged or contested by others. But yeah, it is a very good example, which in a sense, it's slightly different, I think, than this trend with foreign classics, where basically you had the very same translator, right, for let's say 50 years, the same version, the same translation. But I'm thinking maybe translation of theater plays might be different, the question of genres, long novels, and especially that, those that come in volumes and tomes. I mean, maybe this is also something related to that pace of production and translation. But thank you, Ola. Great question again. Cheers.
So we have next question from Monika Zbytniewska. Is translation multiples phenomenon different in other language groups, for example, Asian? Maybe those languages leave less or more room for interpretation?
Interesting question. Well, I'm not a scholar of Asian languages, whatever they are. I assume you mean maybe East Asian languages, right? I would say there would be even more potential in some of the languages, in particular Chinese, which has so many dialectal and different variants. Actually, the question of script is quite interesting, because I think maybe this is where the question comes from. So the fact that you have the script, which in most cases is shared, but at the same time you can have some variance or some variation in those languages. I wouldn't imagine that this is very different. Actually, when we looked, in this prismatic Jane Eyre project, there's one scholar of Chinese who looked at different translations of Jane Eyre into Chinese. And what was quite interesting to see was that there might be some different cultural issues related to the issue of copyrights. So you would have a lot of different versions, or at least those which were marked as different versions, which were technically plagiarized. So you'd have a translator publishing the same translation, but under a different name. And this is also because copyrights and intellectual property is differently legalized in different countries. So some countries actually wrote down their copyrights for translators quite late. And here I would imagine this might be one of the kind of possible ways of answering the question. I wonder whether between East Asian, let's say, maybe languages, whether that would be also something difficult, because when it comes to the transfer, for example, from, let's say, Chinese into English, and this is again one example I had, this idea of the script was quite important. So for one of my examples, 19 Ways of Looking at Wong Wei, an Asian poem, what was quite important was this visual aspect, and this is also something quite important to a Western reader, right? So the fact that this poem is written in pictograms, ideograms, and then there are 19 ways of looking at this poem and translating it differently in 19 different ways, and also looking quite often at the shape and treating it as some sort of cubist exercise. So we are looking at this, and now we are looking from this perspective, from this perspective. So this poem sort of becomes visual just because it's written in a different script, which is not a phonetic script, but a script that also has some meaning in terms of the visual structure. But that's a good question. I have to think about it. I think more whether that's also could be an issue between, East Asian languages. I'll think about it. Thank you.
And now we have a question from Tomek Włodarski.
Okay. Hi, Kasia. Great talk. My question is maybe a little bit naive, but I was just wondering regarding the translations between very distant languages, like, for example, some Asian languages and, I don't know, African languages. I was wondering if the distance in, let's say, evolution of the language is very, very long, then maybe do you need to always have a third language in between to help in the translation, like, I don't know, English or French, because otherwise the translation between them directly is almost impossible because of the distance in understanding of the languages.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Great question. That touches both on the issue of indirect translation, because this is what you're, I think, getting at. So the fact that in some of the languages, there's always this mediating language. And it is quite often the case, I don't know, Ismail Kadare from Albanian had to be translated via French and so on. So also a lot of Polish works, actually. Gombrowicz was also translated quite often from Spanish rather than from the original Polish, or sometimes from English translation, some of the authors. So, this question of perceived distance is also quite important. It is true that if you have, let's say, more maybe less familiar languages, simply the number of translators from these languages is smaller. But then the question is whether I'm now asking myself this question: is it ethical to translate via a third language? And most of the scholars of indirect translation say yes, otherwise we wouldn't have access to all these works. So maybe it's better to have this type of practice rather than not to read Ismail Kadare or Gombrowicz in English, right, at some point. This question of perceived distance is also important for translation multiples, because a lot of tension that happens within text is quite often defined as this distance. So at the beginning, you had, for example, a scholar called Richards, who basically took a Confucian philosopher and wanted to translate his definition into English. And that was at the beginning of the 20th century. And he said, we can't do it one-to-one every single time. I have to translate all these definitions because these languages are so distant, Chinese and English. So there's this conception that, yes, there's this idea that, yes, the kind of perceived distance is an important factor. But on the other hand, this type of practice has happened also within languages which are very closely related. And we see that between Latin and English, that a lot of glosses, a lot of extra commentaries, a lot of translation, well, the multiplied spectrum of translation did happen also within very closely related languages, or German and English. You can also have this type of multiplied practice. You don't always need to have some sort of intermediary or some sort of middleman who is an indirect kind of mediator between those languages. Also, you can think of languages such as Catalan, where a lot of translation production has happened via Spanish, and this is also not only because of the kind of the question of distance or cultural distance, but also because of political reasons. Now, I mean, for ages, for years, there has been a trend to translate, for example, something from English directly into Catalan, not via the mediation of Spanish, because basically then you're also elevating the status, right, of the language by saying, well, we have the, the whole collection, right, of Shakespeare, of the Bible and so on, which was directly translated into Catalan. So your question touches on very interesting things which cannot be really reconciled in some ways, because the answer would be yes, the perceived distance is an important factor when actually looking also at this kind of density of definition, right? So the density of translation, which can be, then overcome by this middleman, by indirect translation or multiple translation. But on the other hand, there are also examples where basically within still closely related languages that happens too. So I'm not sure whether this also answers your question, answers your question, but basically this is the answer I've got. Thank you.
So do we have any more questions? So I actually have one. So you talked about this movie by Kieslowski, Blind Chance, Przypadek, as this form similar to translation multiples. And are there any other examples that are similar in composition, not necessarily in literature, perhaps in film?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are. So thank you, Dominika. So for example, in film, some of you might have heard of Kieslowski's, of Blind Chance's predecessor, Rashomon, a Japanese film by Kurosawa, where basically the construction is very similar. So we don't have access to what happened to the actual murder, but we have 4 different testimonies. And then basically the film is composed as those 4 different testimonies, and we never get access to what is the original. So this is in film. There's a very interesting experiment which was done by an American critic called The Site of Death, where basically for 1 year he kept coming to the same art gallery in New York looking at one painting, and he recorded all different impressions of that painting throughout the year. And basically every day this painting seemed something else to him. So basically he started looking at details, and basically this was a way of translating in multiple ways his experience of looking at this painting. So this could be an essay. Another a literary example would be in French, Raymond Queneau's Exercises in Style, where basically there are 99 different different narratives, different reports of the original incident on a bus. There was an accident on a bus, and there are 99 different ways of reporting it. And basically one is a first person narrative, another is a third person narrative, and basically you look at this one event from using completely different styles, and also you see how the perception of that event changes depending on basically what sort of narrative voice you use. And what's quite important is 99, but there is no 100th version, which is the original one, and basically Queneau also takes it out because basically we never have access to what really happened. So there has been a lot in terms of this, reflection around let's say, some sort of like subjective takes, and they are confronted with one another. In terms of more political example, and this is just one last thing I wanted to say. Oh, sorry, and in the music, of course. So jazz, in a sense, right, is also improvised. Basically, you have the original score, but also in general in music, the idea of musical performance, you have the original score, and then it can be performed in different ways. But in jazz in particular, you had even albums which were recorded like Charlie Parker, basically 2 different takes of the same works and recorded in the same year, but 2 differently improvised albums, and released separately. So you had that in music. But now this more political example, which is like a documentary, which I really love, by Grayson Perry, called Divided Britain After Brexit. So this example might be, an example of translation multiples or multiples in sculpture. So he decided to ask 2 groups, the Remainers and the Leavers, to submit some sort of pictures that would represent their own vote. And they did. And then he put those pictures into 2 big vases. One was 4% smaller than the other one, which was also supposed to represent the vote, 48 versus 52. And basically he put those 2 vases, and he also realized that a lot of people submitted very similar things, in fact. So he asked them to submit a logo, a picture, and then a color that they would associate with their vote and Britain. And most of the groups submitted, or statistically speaking, submitted the same thing, which was blue. The logo was teapot, and then something was BBC, you know, like a company was BBC. And basically he put that on those two vases and then asked those both groups to come and look at each other's vases to kind of see that basically, although, you know, there are two conflicted maybe narratives, there might be more that they actually share. And, you know, he recorded that documentary was actually a recorded, you know, process of creating those vases and procuring them. But also in the last scene, basically you have those groups coming and you have those two, you know, equally, you know, legitimate, you know, responses, right? And then you have those two groups which are, you know, similarly acknowledged in a political public space, let's say in an art gallery. And then they look at each other and they, of course, they were aware of each other before, but now they kind of see each other as this, you know, equally respectable group of people, and they look at these vases. So this is a very important, I think, aspect also of translation multiples. But anyway, thank you, Dominika, for this question.
That's super interesting. Thank you very much. So yeah, thank you, Kasia, for this amazing talk, and thank you everyone for a very, very interesting question and for the discussions. And before we finish, an important announcement. So our next speaker will be Professor Katarzyna Adamala. Katarzyna is a synthetic biologist and a professor of genetics at the University of Minnesota. And more info about the talk is coming very soon, so please follow our social media channels.
Thank you for organizing.